another edition of the Utah Historical Quarterly Authors Conversations. My name is Jedediah Rogers. I am one of the managing editors of the Utah Historical Quarterly, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Robert Parson. He is university archivist at Utah State University, and his most recent piece of scholarship is published in the winter 2015 issue of the Quarterly, entitled Neither Poet Nor Prophet, S. George Ellsworth and the History of Utah. And today I'm sitting down with Robert in special collections at the university, at Utah State University, and we just want to have a conversation about Ellsworth and his place among Utah historians. And maybe we can start with, first I'd like to hear a little bit about you and your career, and then maybe talk to us about how you got started on this particular research project.
Okay, thank you, Jed. Call me Bob, it's fine. Everybody does. Well, I became interested in Ellsworth mostly from the standpoint of the history of this institution. And as university archivist, that's usually what my research interests are and my emphasis is. And Ellsworth played a very key role in a lot of things that developed at this institution from 1954 when he got here as a junior faculty member in history until his retirement in, I think, about 1983 or 4. And he was an integral part of not just the history department but of the library. And so as I researched more about his place within that mix, I come to really appreciate what his contribution was to building collections and to not necessarily using those collections for his own purposes, but to build collections for the benefit of students who would study Utah history.
Mm-hmm. So, if we may, why don't we start by characterizing Ellsworth's legacy as a Utah historian? Where does he fit in among his contemporaries and historians before and since? And maybe begin with this: why is Ellsworth not very well known as a Utah historian, even among historians, but certainly among the general public?
Well, I don't think you can separate as to what his emphasis was on his career. He did not publish very much, and in comparison to a lot of historians whose major contribution was research and writing. And so I think George's lack of publications during his career, and most of his major publications took place after the actual publication of a lot of his books, or after his retirement. They were things that he worked on for 30 years. But he was a perfectionist, and he was a very busy man. Mm-hmm. He taught a lot of classes. Mm-hmm. And so as a consequence, I think he was not as well known as some of his contemporaries. The obvious one there is Leonard Arrington, who wrote dozens and dozens of articles and collaborative books. George was not a collaborator to speak of, Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one reason why he's not as well known. I think he's very well respected amongst his peers of that time period. Very well respected.
What would you say is his major legacy or contribution to our state's history?
Well, I think he's one of those individuals that came along at about the same time period, and they all, well, I won't say all of them, but a lot of them came out of that that Berkeley tradition, and they were trained at Berkeley. I'm thinking of Everett Cooley for one, George Ellsworth, Richard Pohl, and they began a process of taking research that well, let me start again here. History departments, by and large at that time, were primarily teaching departments. And Ellsworth began at a time at this institution, and I can speak mostly about him because he was at this institution. So he began at a time when the history departments began to move more into research, and the institutions themselves began to support research. Prior to that time, mostly what they did is taught, and a lot of through Ellsworth's influence, the institution began to put modest sums of money into research into the social sciences and humanities. Before that time at this institution, this is a land-grant institution, of course, and all of the research dollars went towards agriculture. And so you had a lot of research funds that came into experiment stations and some of the other federal collaborative projects. There was really no money that went into to do social science research. And through Ellsworth and Arrington really got that rolling in the 1950s and convinced the institution to begin to put research dollars in. And that's where Ellsworth's original idea for the book Utah Heritage comes from. It's from a modest sum of money that the institution put in to help him with that. And so I think, that's really kind of the beginning of where people get, where history faculty get an opportunity to do something more than to just teach. The other contribution that he made and was collections. He brought in a lot of collections into to this library when it was, primarily there were no primary sources available, and so he begins to go out and to gather things. Did a lot of microfilm projects and things like that really were the beginnings of what we would call today the special collections here. The same thing could be said about Everett Cooley, who did the same thing at the Historical Society first, and then later at the University of Utah.
Well, I think we want to touch on each of those contributions in our short conversation. Why don't we start with Ellsworth's affinity for the bibliography, for collecting materials? And my understanding is that he developed a real interest in this perhaps during his graduate school days at Berkeley, where he was diving into some of the collections that they had, and some of the rich collections that Bancroft had collected in the late 19th century pertaining to Utah. Maybe talk to us a little bit about his time at Berkeley, and then what skill set he brought to Utah State University and how he began to build up the collections at this institution.
Well, his mantra was no documents, no history. And I think, and I'm just assuming here, when he got to Berkeley, he saw a wealth of primary sources that he'd really never encountered before, and come to understand that a lot of those had not been mined very deeply. I mean, they were Bancroft's collections that he put together to do the book in the 1890s, and of course that's the topic of a couple of UHQ articles that he wrote. And beyond that, his affinity for bibliography, I think, goes to teaching. You put these things together, you make them known, you make them accessible, then you have the opportunity for students to look at these things. And at this institution, that's really the beginning of most of the graduate work in history. That was when Ellsworth got here. I mean, there were one or two, but Ellsworth chaired a lot of graduate committees and directed students towards Utah topics. A lot of them that he had gathered from the Bancroft and from other sources.
What would you say are some of the richest and most interesting materials that he gathered here and that are now housed at special collections?
Well, you know, interestingly, a lot of those things have not, they still haven't been mined very deeply. But from my perspective, of course, I'm pretty myopic in my interests, right? So from my perspective, the local history stuff that he gathered during the publication of the old History of a Valley book is absolutely incredible. Unfortunately, it's in a medium now that is not very popular. Microfilm. Right. And it was a microfilm project that was done in-house, so some of it is not that it's not that well done, you know. So it makes it difficult to use. The other things that are, you know, fairly widely available now are things that he convinced the institution to purchase from the Library of Congress or from the National Archives. And I'm always amazed to look at those records that still are not looked at very deeply because they're hard. It's difficult research work, you know, to look through hours and hours of microfilm. But they're some of the richest sources, and you know, that's not to discount the sources in Ellsworth's collection itself that came in back in the late 1990s. There's a lot of great stuff there.
In your article in the UHQ, you have a delightful little section where you talk about visiting his second home where much of his material was being housed, and noticing that the work area looked chaotic with piles of papers and bundles of note cards everywhere.
Not unlike this table right here, Chad.
Not unlike this.
Yeah.
And maybe that's standard for most archivists and, historians.
Yeah, I mean, I recognized what was going on that table immediately when I walked in. I mean, and historians are not particularly historians' offices are not particularly tidy most of the times. They got a lot of things that they're working on.
You write that he rarely threw anything away. No document was dispensable. No scrap or bit of information was unessential. Both the weighty and trivial, the eminent and ephemeral, all had significance in documenting the past. Talk to us about that. Why do you think that? Was that just a quirk of his personality that he kept every little scrap of information that came his way, or does that reveal his broader approach to doing history?
I think it reveals his bent towards archives. I mean, that's the thing that we struggle with most in the archival profession is the weeding process. What do you discard? I mean, you can have rough guidelines, but it comes down to really to instinct and just making a judgment call, and sometimes that judgment call is wrong. You might think something is not worth the effort to keep, and come to find out later on that it was. Ellsworth, I think, skirted that problem by simply not throwing anything away. And it's in hindsight now, the stuff that he kept from committee meetings and from little clubs and things that he was involved with here on campus is absolute gold, because nobody keeps that kind of stuff, ordinarily. He did. He kept it all, and so it documents a little niche of the university's history that otherwise would be lost. So I'm glad he did keep all that stuff. But I think what it does say is that he had an appreciation for documents, and not just how he might use those documents, but how they would document the past for somebody else's interests or for the institution's necessity to maintain its memory.
Did he also have a role in organizing the materials that he gathered and collected, or did he simply turn them over to other archivists working here?
Like I said at the beginning, I did not know George until towards the end of his life. I wish I would have. I wish I would have had classes from him and things like that. But by the time he finally decided to relinquish these materials, he was probably beyond the point of being able to organize them himself. They were well organized to begin with. Now, if George would have turned these over 10 or 15 years before, he would have probably been the one that organized his collection. Whether he would have ever got it done in the 10 or 15 years that he had left in life is another story. But he was very focused on arrangement, organization, and he did have a lot of suggestions as we took the stuff out of his second home and brought it up here. He had definitely some suggestions as to how he wanted things organized.
Yeah. Well, speaking of 10 or 15 years, his major contribution, or one of his major contributions, was writing the seventh grade history of Utah textbook. But for whatever reason, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that. It took him so long to complete this project. You mentioned earlier that above all he was a teacher, and so it seems natural that he would write the official school textbook in Utah history. But maybe talk to us a little bit about how he came to that project and why it took him so long to write.
Well, his intention, I think, to write a junior high school his intention was to write a freshman history text, and his hope was
freshman in high school. Yeah.
And to simultaneously write a text that could be used for college level. In other words, dumb it down just enough for ninth graders. And the state textbook committee, the curriculum committee, made a decision to keep Utah history in the seventh grade. That was, I think, a huge blow to his plans, because seventh graders are simply not able to. He couldn't take the text that he had envisioned as a college text and simplify that down to the level of a seventh grader. He found that excruciatingly hard. And so over the years that he worked on that, I think what Ellsworth finally decided was to write a book for seventh grade level students, and not to try to write a college level text simultaneously. Of course, Tom and Richard Pohl and others, wrote the college text that was used for years and years and years, and so that market was pretty much taken. But he was methodical, and some may even say plodding in his writing. And so it took him a long time to finish it.
Yeah, that textbook was published in 1972.
72
Is that correct?
First, yes.
Can you
interestingly, that one of the comments that a lot of the teachers made about Utah's heritage was that it was still over the head of most seventh graders. So
I don't know if this
they all loved the book, its layout and everything.
Right.
They hated the binding because it fell apart, but a lot of them thought it was still too advanced for seventh graders.
I've heard that, and I heard that when it was a new edition of it was published, slightly revised, that new edition in 86 or the mid 80s?
Mid 80s.
Was actually it was a simplified version of his original 72 text. Is that true?
I think they tried to simplify it as much as they could. He was always very responsive to comments and teachers, and went out of his way, both he and his publisher, to have the books evaluated by social studies teachers.
Mm-hmm. Can you comment at all on how Ellsworth's school text compares to other textbooks that were published before?
I'm not too familiar with them. I know Ellsworth did not think that they were adequate, and so that was his pitch to the Office of Research here on campus, was that there needed to be another book. Most teachers thought so, and as I mentioned in the article, he took a lot of direction from Ward Roylance's I think a master's thesis that he wrote at the University of Utah, and where he came to the conclusion that teachers needed a new history textbook.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So in 1972, at the time of the textbook's publication, or around that same time, Ellsworth became editor of the Western Historical Quarterly.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through that process? How it is that Ellsworth was involved in the process of bringing the Western Historical Quarterly to Logan, Utah, to Utah State University?
Well, I think there was a proposal sent out by the Western History Association looking for a home for the quarterly. And Ellsworth and Leonard Arrington and others on campus were involved in that. Ellsworth took the lead. There's no question about that. And I think this begins in about 1968. Mm-hmm. And there was, at the time, the Chase administration was nearing the end of its tenure here. And they were not very receptive to the idea. And so when a new administration comes in, Glenn Taggart, they pitch it again to Taggart and to Garth Hansen, the provost, and they're more receptive and agree to support the institute, support the quarterly with office space and staff, and also to give Ellsworth and Arrington release time from their teaching responsibilities, mm-hmm. to be editor and co-editor. I think Ellsworth was always recognized that he was not as well known as some historians, and that Leonard, because he had published so much, even though he was not a historian per se, he was an economist, but he had published widely on the economic history in the West, in the Mountain West, and Utah, and so he was better known, and so Leonard became the editor first until he left to go downstate, and then George moved into that slot.
Mm-hmm. So it was by 1969 it was approved that the quarterly would be housed here at Logan, and for several years Arrington was head editor with Ellsworth as associate editor, and then he became
co-editor. I don't know exactly how that works, but he was associate editor. Mm-hmm. But you know, George was really a workaholic. I mean, there's no question about that. And he did the bulk of the work, mm-hmm. in the quarterly, the editing and everything. I mean, if you go back and look at his papers, see, he was a draftsman as well. George was, and so he was very. I mean, he would sit down. He designed the cover, what it would look like, and the lettering, and I mean, he had it all planned out. Mm-hmm. Planning was his thing, mm-hmm. and so he kept all that stuff. By the way, every little note that he took on the founding of the quarterly, kept all that stuff.
Interesting. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what I find really interesting in your article and in speaking with others about Ellsworth and reading Leonard Arrington's autobiography as well as biography written by Gary Topping, is this kind of interesting, very collegial yet strained relationship between the two men, Ellsworth and Arrington. Of course, they worked together on the Western Historical Quarterly, but I don't know. Maybe can you talk to us a little bit about how the two men's approach to history differed and maybe coincided? I mean, how did Ellsworth's approach to scholarship and publishing differ from Arrington's, for example?
359 degrees. George had particular things that he laid claim to, and things that he worked on from the time he got here until they were eventually published sometime between about 1987 until his death. The Addison Pratt stuff, Samuel Claridge stuff, and I think not to discount Leonard at all, but Leonard was more scattergun in his approach to what he researched and wrote and put his name on, and he was also very much involved in getting little chunks of money here and there and putting students to work on projects. And usually Leonard's name went on them, on the finished product, along with the student's name. He was always gave credit where it was due, but he was always out there. He referred to himself as an entrepreneurial historian. Leonard did. Whether that was tongue in cheek or actually what he thought of himself, but he was always out there looking for little projects that he could do, and he could put students to work on, and he could, he was just very active like that. George, on the other hand, was a loner. That's how he did. As far as I know, until later on, he did not collaborate much with anyone on his projects.
You provided me a copy of Leonard Arrington's diary, dated March 22nd, 1973. And in it, he talks about sort of the establishing of the WHQ at USU. And he mentions that, that Arrington was instrumental in helping Ellsworth become full editor of the quarterly. But Arrington writes that in that change of editorship, the only thing which stung, as far as I was concerned, was George's refusal to have me listed as a member of the board of editors of the Western Historical Quarterly. Why do you think that was?
That whole episode is with the Quarterly's founding, with Leonard's selection to be church historian. I think it fractured the relationship between the two men. I can find no evidence that George ever said anything. But I think if you read that, you can get the idea that there was an estrangement there at that point in time between the two men. And before that, like you said, they were very close colleagues. And I think that Leonard acknowledges that George really helped him understand the difference between an economist and a historian.
But you feel that relationship was strained when Arrington was appointed as church historian, or at least went up to the
Well,
Church
I don't
department.
think Ellsworth held that against Leonard at all. I think he was happy for his friend. But I think the whole setting up of the quarterly, and then I think whether, like I said, George never said much, you know, or at least he didn't leave any paper trail.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you look at what went on there, most of the work was done by George, and most of the credit was given to Leonard, and so that strained the relationship.
I see.
I think.
I see. Interesting. You mentioned in your article this 1972 article published in the Utah Historical Quarterly by Ellsworth, in which Ellsworth sort of scans and surveys Utah historiography, Utah history, makes a couple of interesting comments, and then talks about what yet needs to be done in the field. And one thing that I found really interesting that Ellsworth does is he decried scholars who rush to publication, that present half-baked ideas, and presents, quote, his one idea in 2 or 3 forms and palms those variations off to editors. Maybe he's speaking of Arrington there. I don't know.
Well, he could be speaking of 2 or 3 of his contemporaries, but I wouldn't want to speculate.
Sure, but you know what he seems to be really doing in his article is calling for more contemplative, definitive productions. And I'm wondering. I mean, you sort of mentioned that Ellsworth himself was sort of a perfectionist of sort. But what do you make of that comment, of his comment in his article, particularly in light of Ellsworth's reputation as a careful but not particularly productive scholar?
Well, I think you can read it 2 ways. One is that he viewed some of his contemporaries' publications as less than contemplative. The other thing is maybe an apologetic for himself not being as productive as he should have been, because he was being careful and making sure everything was right before things were published.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's hard to speculate, you know. But I think there is some room to read between the lines on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, another thing that he mentions in his article is that the queen of Utah history is Juanita Brooks. But he says there is no king. And is that because there's just too many hands, you know, in the honey jar, so to speak, or is he really making a larger comment on, because at the end of his article, as well as the end of your piece, you quote something of his in which Ellsworth paid tribute to a long list of historians from Bancroft to Arrington, and
he was gracious in what he said about all historians, but I think George had the idea early in his career that he would write that definitive history. And I think he hoped at the beginning of that would be the concurrent publication of a high school history text and a college history text, and that then that research would then go into a major history of Utah. And of course it was something that he never did do. He never could do. And so, yeah, there's no king that Ellsworth would crown.
Well, maybe we can sort of we can kind of wrap this up by again reflecting on Ellsworth's place among Utah historians, his legacy, his contribution. I mean, certainly a lot of years, 40 years, has passed since his seventh grade history textbook, and that's now no longer really in use. And by and large, he passed away in the 90s.
97.
So it's been almost 20 years since he's passed away. But you know, how do you think it would be appropriate for folks to remember Ellsworth? Is he a figure worth remembering? Did he make, what kind of a contribution did he make then to the state of Utah?
Well, I think Ellsworth trained a whole generation of history scholars that worked under him. They worked under Leonard as well. Tom Alexander, for one. And I think his major contribution is as a teacher. I really do. And a lot of people that got graduate degrees here went on to do things in the field of history, but they also they received a great education.
Are there any Ellsworth stories that you came across in your research that maybe you'd like to share but that didn't make it into your article?
Oh, I don't think any I'd like to share. He could be, what I understand, he had a tendency to shoot from the lip on occasion. But you know, you'll never find any nasty letters in George's correspondence. So what he may have said in private to somebody, he would never he wouldn't put that in writing. So, as I said, I did not know the man well. There was a lot of people that did, and a lot of people that I showed this article to before I sent it into you guys. They told me stories about George. You know? Yeah. But he was very gracious when he turned this material over to us.
So all the material, or the George Ellsworth papers, are housed here in special collections at USU?
They are. Some of the primary documents he felt were better, would be better at the LDS Church Archives. But all of those things they're copies in this collection.
I see.
Some of the journals and stuff that he worked on are with the church because they dealt with Mormon missionaries and establishment of missions in the South Seas.
Well, thank you for taking the time to.
Well, I hope
speak with
it's.
us.
I hope I've said something that's enjoyable. But
And thank you too for your delightful little piece that's published in the most recent edition of issue of the Quarterly. So
I think there's a lot of historians in Utah that probably deserve a similar little piece. That may not have the. They may not have the appeal of a Leonard Arrington or a Juanita Brooks or others that have had major biographies done of them, but they all played a very big role in their institutions themselves. So maybe somebody that knows some of these other people will contribute another article on them.
I hope so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.